समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
The partridge with foie gras and truffle stuffing had been catered by Maxims of Paris, accompanied by Pink Dom Perignon and a Chateau Lafite from the Rothschild vineyard. For 4.5 hours, Empress Farah of Iran, dressed in gold brocade and a wreath of diamonds towering above her head, stood by the side of her husband Muhammad Raza Pahlavi, mingling with the world's royals. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, King Frederick IX of Denmark, King Mahendra of Nepal, Prince Bernard of the Netherlands, Prince Philip of Britain, and Field Marshal Yahya Khan of Pakistan, President Nikolai Podgorny of the Workers' Paradise, the Soviet Union, and India's own austere, strictly vegetarian President V.V. Giri. Everyone who mattered, and a few who did not, were all present under the light of the giant chandeliers to honor 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy. For just those few hours on 15 October 1971, the resentments and tensions of the real world seemed to have been put aside. Even though dignitaries from South Africa were present, the rest of the Africans did not walk out. The Indians and Pakistanis who were about to go to war and knew it, chatted with each other. Little things, like the refusal of the British to loan Iran the clay tablet of Cyrus the Great, which is kept in London, were glossed over. Nobody wanted to talk about unpleasant things. Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Print Explorer. For many days now, the world's been trying to make sense of Pakistan's emergence as a key actor in the peace talks between Iran and the United States. I'm going to be looking today in particular at how Iran and Pakistan came to be enmeshed in a close geopolitical embrace, what you might call a friends with benefits relationship, and why that relationship sometimes became very, very poisonous. The story has all the elements of a great novel. Geopolitics, faith, wealth, hubris, betrayal. It was all there. That very day, the 15th October 1971, as Empress Farah and the Shah entered the grand tent they'd had designed by the Parisian interior design firm Maison Janssen, the government in exile of Bangladesh had requested India for formal diplomatic recognition. Fleeing the genocidal violence of the Pakistan army, millions of refugees had already streamed across the border into India. And led by Major General Surjit Singh Uban, Indian covert forces, the so-called Establishment 2-2, had begun operating deep inside East Pakistan, preparing the ground for the army in the war that was now almost certain. Foreign Secretary A.H. Amin, Pakistan's Foreign Secretary that is, had called the American ambassador the same day with a desperate appeal to the White House. And judging by that telegram, it was sent at around the same time, I'm guessing, the foie gras and partridge were being served to Field Marshal Yahya Khan. That message read, for West Pakistan to survive as a nation, it is necessary that it be provided additional fighter craft. The present trickle of MiG-19s and F-104s cannot stem the tide. Mr. Amin did not tell his US interlocutors of the source of that traffic that cable records. But, as we'll see, it didn't take a lot to guess. American diplomats posted in Tehran had heard from a businessman who'd seen 3 state-of-the-art McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II parked at the Tehran airport with Pakistan Air Force markings. The businessman had been really intrigued because the Pakistan Air Force did not fly F-4s. And he made the obvious deduction about what was going on. Later on, Iranian officials told the Americans that the planes had come from Libya, but inquiries rapidly established that the tail numbers were part of a consignment of 8 that had been parked in California, meant for the Libyans, and never delivered. Someone else had paid for them and kept them ready for the Pakistanis. The Shah, another diplomatic cable from Tehran, noted on the 8th of December 1971, had urged the United States to tell King Hussein of Jordan to send more of his country's F-104 fighters to Pakistan. And that was the type Pakistan knew how to fly, because they'd had them since the last war in 65, paid for by Iran. Iran, the Shah promised, would move 2 of its own squadrons of F-104s to Jordan to protect it for the duration of the Bangladesh war. The deal never did fully work out, but it's clear some of those F-104s were sent. The MiG-19s, similar to the J-6 Chinese knockoffs flown by the Pakistan Air Force, had come from Syria, a country where the PAF was then training fighter pilots. Now, all of this had no real impact on the war. Pakistan was just comprehensively outclassed. But it helps understand the enormous challenges, geopolitical challenges before India, as it struggled to operate in a Middle East that was just as important then as it is now, but configured politically very, very differently. Long queues of Iranians can often be seen outside 1250 23rd Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. That's the Pakistani embassy. But the Iranians aren't there looking for a visa to visit Pakistan or whatever. The Iranian Republic's law mandate that all individuals of Iranian origin can travel home only on an Iranian passport, not their American ones. Since every year the Iranian diaspora in the United States grows and many new people need to go home to attend weddings or visit elderly relatives, the number of passport seekers keeps growing. In 1979, as many of you will know, students had seized the American embassy in Tehran and held the American diplomats hostage in one of the most notorious episodes in modern diplomatic history. The United States responded by seizing the Iranian embassy, though not the diplomats, in Washington, as retaliation. Then, in 1981, there was an effort to cool things off. And one of the agreements made that year was to let a third country house bare-bones diplomatic missions in each other's capitals. Algeria was initially nominated by Iran to serve as what is called a protecting power. That is, the embassy operated under the protection of this third country. The Algerians, though, broke their ties with Iran in 1992 after the clerics ruling the country supported a terrorist group called the Islamic Salvation Front. The Islamic Salvation Front had killed thousands of Algerians, and this relationship, the support of the clerics, Iranian clerics, for the Salvation Front was absolutely unacceptable to Algeria. Islamabad then agreed to step in and house the Iranian Interest Office in Washington on its own premises. This began as a small office on Wisconsin Avenue, which later shifted to the modern, spacious premises it is at now. To really understand why this alliance existed at all, though, you have to go quite a bit back in history. The military power of the empire of Maharaja Ranjit Singh and his successors, the British East India Company, ensured Persia's Qajar dynasty was never able to expand east beyond the Indus River. I'll tell you the story one of these days of a wonderful Indian spy working for the East India Company who's called Mohanlal Kashmiri. And he was the guy who terrified the Persians using a mix of fact and bluff into keeping their eyes off India. Anyway, the point is, the British feared the Tsars might still expand south and saw Persia as a kind of buffer between the Russian Empire and India. For their part, the Persians were extremely suspicious of British intentions, and with pretty good reason. The Portuguese presence in the Persian Gulf, which had swallowed up all the local powers, was inherited by the East India Company. The East India Company, of course, also occupied Sindh and then soon expanded further west into the borders of Persia. Not all this expansion was military. Hindu merchants and Sikh truck drivers blazed new routes through the Balochistan desert, bringing Indian-made goods into Iran. These goods were very welcome by local consumers, and in fact you'll see that even today there are Indian business people in Iran and a reasonably sized Sikh community in the island of Zahedan. But that's another story for another day. Even though the British never formally colonized Iran, everyone knew who was actually boss. British influence kept expanding until in 1941, the British and the Soviet Union simply carved Iran up into two zones of influence to keep Nazi Germany out. Reza Shah Pahlavi, who the British had installed as the monarch of the brand new Pahlavi dynasty in 1921, he was just a minor officer, was kicked out of the country and his teenage son installed in his stead. The Second World War, though, drained the United Kingdom of the resources it needed. The empire could no longer afford to police its restive Asian colonies, and it was soon clear they would have to give up the West Asian territories in the Persian Gulf that it had acquired and protected to guard the routes into India. The Americans had now emerged as the preeminent power and had their own client state, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia slowly began to emerge as the region's most important axis of power. In 1953, when the United Kingdom wanted to bring down the little too independent Iranian government which had briefly held power around that time and had nationalized its oil industry, the British, as I said, had to turn to the CIA to get the job done. And from the mid-1960s, the British realized that the time had finally come for them to get out of the region. And that's where Pakistan comes in. Francis Tucker, the last commander of the British Indian Army, spells this out pretty clearly in his memoirs, which are really worth reading. Tucker, like many of his peers, believed a left-leaning Turkey and decaying Persia had no chance of resisting a communist push southwards. Southwards where? Towards India, where the British were leaving. Hindus, Tucker simply seemed to despise, asserting that, and I quote, no other race could live among them. He wrote, there was much to be said, therefore, for the introduction of a new Muslim power supported by the science of Britain. If such a power could be produced, and if we could orient the Muslim strip from North Africa through Islamia Deserta, Persia and Afghanistan to the Himalayas, upon such a Muslim power in northern India, then it had some chance of halting the filtration of Russia towards the Persian Gulf. Look at a map and you'll know exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about Pakistan and a broad alliance of Islamic powers stretching on to Egypt. With a northern Indian Islamic state, Tucker writes, of several millions, it would be reasonable to expect that Russia would not care to provoke them too far. Now, America didn't always have the expertise on hand to challenge this kind of thinking. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, in one of my favorite stories, attempted to educate the very well-known journalist Walter Lippmann in 1954 on why America needed a mutual defense pact with Pakistan. The only Asians who can really fight are the Pakistanis, John Foster Dulles declared. That's why we need them in the alliance. We could never get along without the Gurkhas. Lippmann gently pushed back. Foster, the Gurkhas aren't Pakistanis, they're Indians. Well, Dulles replied, undisturbed by reality, they may not be Pakistanis, but they're Muslims. No, I'm afraid they're not Muslims either, Lippmann persisted. But the journalist was wasting his breath. The Defense Pact happened, leading to the creation of a kind of Eastern NATO called the Baghdad Pact, later the Central Asian Treaty Organization, which involved Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. Iraq would walk out of this group in 1959 after getting rid of its monarchy, and nothing really came of it. It never became a NATO-like grouping. But America ended up sabotaging its relationship with India from that day on for many, many decades. Now, Islamabad became superb players of this Islamic anti-communism card. General Akhtar Abdul Rahman Khan, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate Chief who led the jihad against the Soviet Union, put it to an American delegation thus, I quote, "An Islamic Afghan republic could be expected to join with Pakistan, Turkey, and Iran come to its senses in an Islamic league to oppose southward Soviet expansion. This kind of Islamic bloc," General Akhtar argued, "could alone defend Pakistan and the Indian Ocean against the Soviet," I quote, "historic desire to expand toward the warm waters of the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea." America's ambassador to India, John Gunther Dean, who'd actually read a book or two, knew the czars of Russia had never actually wanted to expand south, and that the Soviet Union didn't have the resources to do so, even if they wanted to. The ambassador wrote a one-word comment you can now see on the side of the Akhtar memo when it came to its table, and that word was, I quote, "nonsense." Islamabad's membership of the Baghdad Pact, which, as I told you, became the Central Treaty Organization in 1955, opened doors for its military across the Middle East. Pakistan at that time was the only Islamic power, if you want to call it that, which had a proper British-trained military in substantial numbers, with engineering and logistics knowledge, with officers who knew how to conduct teaching, all the paraphernalia of a modern military. And it had one other advantage: though its troops were Muslims, they were not Arabs entrenched in local fights and struggles and problems that are endemic in any culture. The American decision to provide military equipment to Pakistan also ended up causing quite a lot of damage to intelligence and military cooperation with Pakistan. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and his then Intelligence Bureau Chief B.N. Sanjeevi had been quite positive on developing the US relationship. This was in part because many of the challenges to the new Indian Republic, remember, came from communists, like in Telangana, where an insurgency had raged right after independence. Even after the rise of CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, India kept lines of cooperation open with the United States because it knew there was a rising threat from China, which had occupied Tibet, but the relationship never really flowered. And Pakistan, on the other hand, was doing better and better. Iran was the very first Islamic country to contribute significantly to Pakistan's military. A recently declassified CIA memorandum prepared in 1973 records that, I quote, "The Indians are fully aware that in 1966, Iran bought 90 Canadian-built Sabre jet fighters in West Germany and then transferred them to Pakistan." Now, these rumors have been there, this has been talked about, but this is first-hand authentic documentation from no less than the CIA. The document also notes that Iran provided the Pakistanis with ammunition and safe harbor for their military aircraft in the 1971 war, which is now very, very clear. Now, we don't have an archive that explains to us what Tehran's motives were for cultivating Pakistan, but it's possible to make some informed guesses. Almost certainly, the Shah of Iran saw the Pakistanis as insurance to ensure regime survival if push came to shove. The British, as I mentioned, had begun their pullout from the Persian Gulf in the 1960s. That had brought a number of local emirs in the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar to power. But it had also led to a bunch of coups and counter-coups. In 1962, a rebellion broke out in Oman's Dhofar region, pitting left-wing North Yemen against an alliance of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and secretly behind the scenes, Israel and Britain. Iran sent in some 1,200 troops on the Saudi side and learnt the obvious lesson. It might have had a really well-equipped army with the latest American weapons, but a well-equipped army isn't the same thing as a well-trained one. Through the same decade, Iran began seizing islands in the Persian Gulf. Many of those islands now are the ones over which this entire issue of the Strait of Hormuz is linked. This irked its one-time CENTO partner, Iraq, as well as the Persian Gulf states. So, anticipating blowback, the tie-up with Pakistan. Large numbers of other countries in the region also hired Pakistan in various quasi-mercenary roles, sometimes paying for its services with cash, sometimes with loans, cheap oil, and so on. Amman, interestingly, developed ties with both India and Pakistan through its Kolkata-born Princess Sarwat Al Hassan, part of the family of the prominent politician and later Pakistani Prime Minister Hussain Shahid Surawarti. In September 1970, when Palestinian insurgents tried to overthrow King Hussein's regime, a Pakistani brigade led by to-be army chief and dictator Ziaul Haq was called in. Now, again, we don't have a lot of archival documentation on what the exact Pakistani role was in that fighting. That phase was called Black September. But former CIA officer Bruce Rydell has written that Zia was key to leading the Jordanian response to the Palestinian attacks. There are several accounts of Pakistani pilots fighting on the side of Syria in the wars of 1967 and 73. The Syrian embassy in Islamabad honored Air Commodore Sattar Alvi for his role in the 1973 war. Now, the citation doesn't say what Air Commodore Alvi's role was, at least not the public accounts of it that have been released. But there are media stories that he shot down an Israeli Mirage while flying a Syrian MiG-21. Again, the citation doesn't refer to this, but it's most certainly possible. Even more important, Pakistan was paid to set up a division-sized armoured formation in Tabuk in Saudi Arabia. I'd written about this formation just a few days ago, and you can find more there if you're interested. But the Saudi monarchy had just been destabilized quite heavily by a coup d'etat attempted by a few hundred followers of the fundamentalist of the Jama al-Salafiyya al-Muhtasiba in 1979. That was an organization that was a right-wing Salafist organization, very similar in ideology to what Al-Qaeda would become a few years later, and nowhere near as well armed as it was. But this pressure was coming from poorer Saudi Arabs who felt left out by not having a share of the spoils of the oil boom and felt that there was too much cultural liberalization going on. Now, there's a rather large mythology around this issue in Pakistan, and people say, that Pakistani commandos were very involved in protecting Mecca during those operations. But no serious account of what happened says that soldiers of any other country were involved. All they say is that Saudi Arabia turned to French Special Forces personnel, 3 of them, who organized the operations. And even this was seen as a provocation to some Muslims who insisted that no unbeliever could enter the city. Following the Iranian Revolution, and that really shook up the Middle East, Pakistan is reported to have provided military services to some 22 countries in the Middle East. Now, I've never actually seen a listing of those 22 countries, and it seems like a very long list. But we do know the Pakistani division in Saudi Arabia operated tanks, built an entire garrison, but it was pulled out after the first Gulf War when large number of American troops entered the kingdom and took responsibility for the protection not just of Kuwait but Saudi Arabia. Now, in our times, we're seeing that Saudi Arabia seems to have invited back Pakistani soldiers, probably as part of making backup plans in case things go wrong and the Americans pull out their forces somewhere in the future. We don't know how many of these troops are involved or will be involved. The relationship between the Islamic Republic of Iran, meanwhile, and Pakistan has been much more complicated than in the times of the Shah. The two countries have continued their cooperation, but they've also clashed pretty regularly. The Pakistani nuclear scientist Abdul Qadir Khan, we know, sold Iran the technology that allows it to enrich its uranium, the root cause, or one of the root causes of the unfolding crisis. At the same time, though, Pakistan is also putting land forces in Iran's rival, Saudi Arabia. By some accounts, Pakistan has even promised to defend Saudi with its nuclear weapon should a crisis involving some kind of existential threat ever develop. Saudi Arabia is known for decades to have contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to Pakistan's nuclear and missile programs for exactly that purpose. Iran and Pakistan have criticized India on Kashmir several times, but Tehran has also steadily cooperated with India to battle the Taliban and other jihadists in Afghanistan. Indeed, Pakistan regularly complains that Iran has turned a blind eye to Indian intelligence activities in Balochistan, helping Baloch insurgents. India and Iran, as you may know, cooperated on the port in Chabahar, and which was a direct challenge to Pakistan's big plans for its rival port in Gwadar. Iranian and Pakistani forces, meanwhile, have clashed on the border in Balochistan quite regularly over the last decade. And yet, even while all this happens, Pakistan, as I said at the beginning of this program, hosts Iran's interests in Washington and mediates its talks with the United States. Or to be precise, it sometimes says it's mediating, sometimes says it's just facilitating, and we won't know the whole truth for decades, but still, it's in the thick of things. Like Pakistan's relationship with the United States itself, its ties to Iran are not ideological. Both sides are concerned with extracting what gains they can as they navigate a dangerous, often hostile world. There's maybe a lesson India can learn from this. Diplomacy isn't about making friends or enemies, but taking what you can get from the reality of the other nation states' conditions, circumstances, resources. Principles and past good deeds or past villainous deeds don't count for a lot, at least in the Iran-Pakistan relationship. At once, the Iran-Pakistan story also shows, though, that a durable relationship needs to go deeper than a mercenary exchange if it's to have any solidity. A deeper economic relationship with the Middle East might have given Pakistan real heft had it been able to trade with Iran, like the British India did once upon a time. But the truth is, Pakistan never really had anything to bring to the table for an economic or technological relationship. Where do things go from here? Well, Pakistan's a useful messenger to pass things on, to send messages back, without committing either Iran or the United States to a face-to-face dialogue. Pakistan is also a valuable ally. All players in the Middle East think they can use from time to time to its ends, to their own ends. It doesn't fundamentally alter any relationship, but it does tell us one very important lesson. Geopolitics isn't about friendship, it's about getting what you can get. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of ThePrint Explorer.